Why has interest in foliar feeding increased so much?
I think the actual answer is because it works, but we're gaining a better understanding as we're moving along as well.
One of the leading drivers of why we've seen an increase is because, as you said a minute ago, they do work. Well, I think they work because the formulations are better than they used to be, and it's not necessarily about a genetic response as much as it is that. What nutrients should a grower really be paying attention to?
I really like what Nachurs puts together on this. We want to influence the plant with what it needs at that time, so at a period of influence. And it will change throughout the plant's life, especially let's look at soybeans. Soybeans, we're not worried that much about their vegetative growth. I mean, we need them up high enough so that we can get them combined, but the real money comes whenever they start filling pods. But at that vegetative time, we're really worried about setting the enzyme process, the hormone processes, all those kind of things.
Timing, from my perspective, is sometimes just as important as the product itself.
Early reproductive stages, R1, R2, into R3, that is a critical point. If everything's right in the soil and you have great soil nutrition, even your micronutrients, that might be the most critical time. But I think under most growing conditions and most people's soil fertility levels, I really believe the most critical time would be a late vegetative state on the soybeans.
Dollars and data on Cam Seeds Radio.
Welcome back to Dirt, Dollars, and Data, the podcast where we help farmers make better decisions, grow bigger yields, and more profitable operations. I'm your host, Chad Mustain with Cam Seeds, and today's topic is one that has exploded over the last several years, and that is foliar feeding soybeans. It's something that I've seen a tremendous amount of interest in, especially in the last few years, and I think that's partly because everywhere you look these days, there are products that are claiming more pods, bigger beans, stress reduction, higher yields. There's boron, there's sulfur, there's potassium, biologicals, carbon products, microbials. I mean, it's absolutely endless. But the question really becomes, in my mind, what's actually making farmers money and what's just adding cost? And to help answer those questions today, I'm joined by Wayne Becker from Nachurs Fertilizer, and really excited to have you on today, Wayne. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
You bet, you bet. So take a couple of minutes here, Wayne, and talk to us about your background and your involvement over your career in the ag industry.
Okay, so I grew up in, north central Texas, and after going to college and coming back, nothing in life I wanted to do more than continue on with the dairy farm, the family dairy farm. So I came back from college and dairied for, 11 years, and it was a small farm, so the hours were extremely long, and the older I got, the more the hours that I put in, and just didn't add up. It was just so much work trying to keep everything going. We'd get up at 3 a.m. and keep going until 10 a.m. during the summer. So kind of with some family discussion, I moved to Texas AgriLife Extension. So I was a county extension agent for the next 10 years of my life, and that was wonderful too. I enjoyed all the people I got to work with, and I really enjoyed trying to promote agriculture and good best management practices to help make a difference in the agricultural world. But there wasn't quite as much agriculture in being a county extension agent as I'd like. So I went back to school to get my doctorate. So my thought was I'd probably become an extension specialist. But upon getting my doctorate, I found Nachurs. And since then, I've had several positions within the company, but most of the while I'm the South Region agronomist, and that's my position today.
All right. Well, I appreciate that background there, and I think it will provide us a really nice perspective as we talk about foliar feeding today. And let's just dive right into that, Wayne. Why are we talking about foliar feeding anyway? As I alluded to a few minutes ago, it seems like foliar nutrition has gone, at least in my territory here, from something that a few guys were doing 10 or 15 years ago to something that most growers, or at least a lot of the ones that I'm working with, are considering it, and considering it on every acre these days. So the question for you, Wayne, is why has interest in foliar feeding increased so much?
I think that's a very good question, and I think the actual answer is because it works. But we're gaining a better understanding as we're moving along as well. So initially, even in my career, foliar feeding was seen as a way to get more nutrients in the plant, which it certainly is. But a good foliar feed with the right source of nutrients, the right source of other ingredients, does so much more for the plant than just catch it up on nutrients if it happens to be deficient. It can stimulate plant health, soil health, and provide a good dose of nutrition. So you can help that plant perform so much better in so many levels, and it's not just about the nutrients. And I think the results are speaking for themselves, and people are seeing higher yields and better returns with those foliar feeds, and that's probably the reason you're seeing it take off. But there's also a better understanding, and I think we're able to explain why you should foliar feed better.
So I've often thought a lot about some of the things you just said, and one of the things that I've wondered, and I guess give me your opinion, is do you think today's soybean genetics are more responsive to it, or have we just learned more? Or perhaps even maybe the products that we're applying or the formulations are better. Talk to us about that.
That's how I was going to answer that when you started the question, is I really think that the products we're using have changed. Even when I was in Extension 20 years ago, a pound of pea is a pound of pea was something that we kind of learned. But as I get into the industry, in the fertilizer industry, there's every fertilizer, every nutrient that we're after comes with some sort of hitchhiker. You're not just getting a straight potassium element. It's riding along. The dry potassium that we're used to using is potassium chloride. It's 60% potassium and 45% chloride. Well, the chloride's not going to perform very well as a foliar feed if we melt that down. So now that we have better access to other nutrients, and we're learning that different forms of nutrients perform differently for microbials, for in the soil, for plant health, absorption's different. As we learn that, we can get a better product out there. So I really think it's the product more so than the variety that's changed that's making the foliar feeds perform. That's my opinion. Somebody else may debate that.
Well, I don't necessarily disagree with you. In my mind, that's really been one of the leading drivers of why we've seen an increase is because, as you said a minute ago, they do work. Well, I think they work because the formulations are better than they used to be, and it's not necessarily about a genetic response as much as it is that. And so with that being said, then let's talk for just a minute about what nutrients actually matter. And of course, we're talking about soybeans today, but what nutrients actually matter? When a grower thinks about foliar nutrition, what should he be concerned with? In my mind, the first thing that always comes up is boron, but there are so many other nutrients out there. And so what nutrients should a grower really be paying attention to?
I really like what Nachurs puts together on this. We want to influence the plant with what it needs at that time. So at a period of influence, and it will change throughout the plant's life. Especially, let's look at soybeans. Soybeans, we're not worried that much about their vegetative growth. I mean, we need them up high enough so that we can get them combined, but the real money comes whenever they start filling pods. But at that vegetative time, we're really worried about setting the enzyme process, the hormone processes, all those kind of things. So in a vegetative time, I'm going to probably look at a different foliar feed than I am whenever we go to the reproductive. Other factors to consider are, what does your soil need help with? What nutrients really will help the crop that we're looking at? And whenever it comes to soybeans, potassium's a big one. I mean, potassium, the demand, whenever a soybean plant starts trying to go reproductive, it just has a huge demand for potassium, a lot in a short amount of time, and it's hard for the roots to keep up no matter how much potassium's in the soil. So potassium may be one of the most important ones when it comes to soybean, in my opinion. Going back to your boron, yes, boron's terribly important. It's a very interesting nutrient to foliar feed, though. So boron should help you retain the pods, correct? Mm-hmm. And should help make more crop because you have more pods, more beans. But boron acts different than other nutrients in a plant. In a soybean plant, boron, when you foliar feed it, it does not reload into the plant phloem and move out of that leaf and move into the new areas and the new growth. So you've satisfied the plant for a moment. Mm-hmm. And that's great if you hit the key time, but you really need to hit them with more boron again later to get the new growth sufficient. And now it does move up through the xylem, so if you get enough boron in the soil, it will always continually get what it wants. So a little boron all the time, I'm a big fan in when you're foliar feeding soybeans, definitely. But to answer your question, I really think potassium's
It's number one. Potassium number one. So with that being said, then what nutrients do you feel like a grower can target to maximize the yield? I mean, if you could only pick out of all of them, manganese, zinc, potassium, boron, sulfur, all of that stuff, if you could only pick one or two, which two would be at the top of your list to target a yield response?
Well, absolutely, boron and potassium probably
Okay.
definitely. But again, that there are situations that would not fit because each soil, for all the fertility that's in the soil can certainly be different. So.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, and that's going to segue into another segment here in just a few minutes where we talk about tissue sampling. But before we get into that, I want to zero in a little bit more on this boron, and one of the reasons that I want to is because it's really in my experiences in this territory and during my career, boron is one of the most talked about nutrients when we get to that reproductive stage. And I remember a number of years ago seeing an article and reading an article in one of the publications that the title of it was Boron, the Soybean Superstar. And so for years, at least again, in this territory, it's been one of the most talked about foliar nutrients for beans. But is boron, in your opinion, really as important as it's made out to be? How does it actually benefit the soybean plant during that reproductive stage?
You're pushing me pretty hard on that one. Boron is certainly, it helps transport sugars and everything else. And it helps with pollination and it helps with pod set. But I'm just a firm believer that a boron should be in your foliar just to keep the plant satisfied along the way. We're a lot of times very limited on boron in our soil because it's a mobile nutrient and it'll leach out of your soil just like nitrogen will, and it moves with nitrogen. But at the same time, the plant can determine how much boron and what it needs better. I really like boron if I had a side dress or something like that. So quantities of boron in a side dress, a little bit in the foliar, just to make sure that we retain those pods, move the sugars, keep the so while that's what I've seen really work. So when it comes to boron, that's how I really like to promote it. So I know it's been a foliar, and it has a lot of legs as a foliar because the timing of it that we need is where it's most important is right in there where we're setting those pods. And it's been a superstar because we've missed it in the soil. But it's, as a foliar feed, it's one of those that I think we can maybe do better if we get our soil levels up. And so how do I normally use boron? I really like to add it into my nitrogen side dress on corn. I know it's hard to do those kind of things with our soybeans, but I like to add quantities, a quart to half gallon when I'm going into the soil. And we're talking ounces whenever I'm going with a foliar feed. So it's not following the foliar feed topic, but that's how I believe boron would be a better superstar.
Okay. Well, that makes a lot of sense to me, and I appreciate that perspective, and I think that's something that I just really wanted to address because it's been such a big topic over the years, and so appreciate your comments about that. Now, let's take this in a different direction for just a minute. So one of the questions that I get all of the time is if I'm already making a post-herbicide application, should I add a foliar nutritional to the tank at that time? I mean, I think a lot of guys, most of the foliars around here are going on at that R3 stage, fungicide applications, those types of things. But does it make sense to put it in with a herbicide application? Can it help some of the stress mitigation and those types of things? So talk to us about your thoughts there.
Yeah, that is absolutely, it makes sense to ride along with the herbicide when you're going over the field anyway. you've got your major expense is the application and the herbicide. If we can do a little to push that crop along, maybe even help the herbicide out, because some of the nutritionals will actually help the efficacy of the herbicide. A lot of the herbicides are trying to grow the plant to death, and if we can, or the weed to death, and if we can get that weed to get going and try to grow, it'll get that herbicide in there better and kill the weeds a little bit better. And at the same time, it's an opportunity to apply necessary nutrients to the plant. And herbicide is usually done in a vegetative state. And at that point in time, we can very effectively get a lot of micronutrients in the plant. And while boron is one of those, that's one that we look at a little bit later in a bigger sense. Things such as manganese and zinc and copper, they'll help set, maybe a little molybdenum, will help set the enzyme processes and the hormone processes on the plant. And micronutrients mean that you just need a few of them. You know, it's a small amount. So we can do a great job getting a pretty adequate amount of micronutrients into a plant early on. So those early herbicide passes, I look at micronutrients first and foremost.
So one of the things that I've always thought about, and I've kind of explained it like this, and punch holes in what I'm about to tell you if you see any, but when I talk to a grower about adding a foliar nutritional to a herbicide pass, the thing that I always think about is, number one, when you're spraying that herbicide across the field, the weed is taking the herbicide in. And the weed has to metabolize it, and that's the problem, of course, depending on how the herbicide works, and that's a whole nother discussion, but it can effectively metabolize the herbicide, and it dies. Okay, well, the soybean plant is also taking in the herbicide, and it also has to metabolize that chemical. And so as it's doing that, I've always had this thought process around that it takes roughly about 7 days in the right growing conditions for it to metabolize that herbicide. And while it's doing it, the plant typically is not translocating nutrients up through the plant because it's going through that metabolizing process. So from that perspective, it's always made sense to me to add a foliar nutritional to that herbicide pass because you're feeding it while it's metabolizing. So
you did ask about stress and stress mitigation, absolutely. So in the early days when we had Roundup Ready soybeans, we talked about yellow flash a lot. Do you remember that?
Oh yeah.
So that was a manganese deficiency that we noticed because Roundup tied up cations, and manganese was one of the big ones that it ties up. So if we add a little bit of manganese with that Roundup application, that plant just kept going, and it never looked backwards. So when we have an effective foliar feed with the right amount of nutrients, and maybe that's why I really like the micronutrients on soybeans in a vegetative state, because those herbicides do tie up some of those nutrients or make it hard for the plant to keep going. So we give it a burst of health, let it keep going if we make it more sufficient in zinc, copper, manganese, those kind of nutrients whenever we're putting that fertilizer out there, herbicide out there.
So then from your perspective then, you do feel like that a foliar nutritional with a herbicide pass helps mitigate some of that stress. I mean, I've had guys come into my office and think that, well, that's mostly a marketing scheme or something that's just a waste of money. But from a biological standpoint, when we think about a soybean plant, it does make sense.
Yeah, so to put it another way, a good effective foliar feed doesn't provide all the nutrients the plant's going to need. What it does is it makes it healthier, it maximizes those nutrients in that period of time. Then the plant can photosynthesize better, and you have a healthier plant. So if you give it that stress at the same time that you're giving it a Z-Pack, sort of, you've absolutely overcome some of those challenges that the herbicide's going to impose on the crop. So I agree with you very much.
Okay.
Yes.
So while we're on this subject, we're talking about applying it with a herbicide pass, which has to do with timing. Let's kind of dive into that topic of timing then. Go ahead.
I might back up. So there is one concern that you certainly need to watch out for with your herbicide pass. Certain micronutrients are capable of tying up some of the herbicide, and most people that are selling you a foliar fertilizer and they know that it's going to be paired with a herbicide are going to make sure that they're not giving you a sulfated micronutrient that's going to tie up Roundup, but that can happen. So the form of nutrient is a big deal, and that's maybe part of the first question you asked. We learned better how to use different forms of nutrients, and we want to make sure that we have the right source of nutrient in there.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point to bring it up, and I'm glad you did, because there are so many things. When we start talking about tank mixing all these things together, there's a lot of things to consider, and there's a lot of things that can tie up some of those herbicides, and then the herbicide gets all the blame for not working, but in reality, a lot of times it could be our tank mix, and so
could be the water.
Yeah,
right?
And it could be the water. We just talked about that in the last podcast that I did. The pH of the water can really have a significant effect, not just on herbicides, but insecticides and a number of other things. So appreciate you bringing that up. So as we talk then about timing, we talked about the herbicide pass here, but timing from my perspective is sometimes just as important as the product itself. And so what is the best, if you could only apply one foliar pass for the growing season, what time frame would that be?
That's such a tough question to answer. I mean, I can answer it, but there's two really key times. I mean, I'd say very crucial is early reproductive stages, R1, R2, into R3 even. That's a critical point. If everything's right in the soil and you have great soil nutrition, even your micronutrients, that might be the most critical time. But I think under most growing conditions and most people's soil fertility levels, I really believe the most critical time would be a late vegetative state on the soybeans. And the reason for that is there's enough leaf area there to catch quite a bit of the foliar nutrition that's going out. We're able to still set those hormone and enzyme processes with a good micronutrient pack. It's late enough that the potassium demand is starting to come on, so adding some potassium into that, and a proper source of potassium that we like to promote has a carbon source along with it, which I think we're going to talk a little bit about later. And so you can do all of those things in that late pass, maybe even some phosphorus in there, late herbicide, late vegetative pass. So I would pick that as my most critical in most conditions.
Okay. And that's what I've always thought, and that's been what we have tailored our recommendations around for years. And so let's talk about that for just a second then. If we're timing that around R1 to R3, what is the number one nutrient you want in that pass?
When we're going R1 to R3, my number one nutrient is, I'm going to go to potassium again now. There I'm going to...
Okay, even that late.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, we're pulling potassium from that late vegetative stage all the way to that R3 stage just really hard. And potassium, it moves nutrients and sugars back in. I mean, it'll start helping you fill the seed. The root systems quit expanding, and potassium is taken up by the roots better whenever the roots are still expanding. So it's potassium uptake can kind of top off as you get just beyond that point. So to set that plant up, whenever we go into any of the reproductive stages, late vegetative reproductive stages, potassium's the one I look at most.
Okay. So how about boron?
Boron's important at that point.
Okay, so we're back to that whole potassium and boron combination there. So that makes a lot of sense. Doesn't necessarily surprise me. No surprises there. So let's take this thing now, Wayne, in maybe a little bit different direction for a minute, and let's talk about tissue testing and the benefits. that it potentially has to your foliar nutritional program. And the question for some may be, you know, is it a useful tool or is it just a bunch of extra paperwork? And I've seen both sides of the spectrum. I've seen guys go out and do it, and it just ended up being a bunch of extra paperwork, and they never utilized it or maximized the data. On the flip side, I've seen folks do the opposite and go out and gather all the data and maximize the return on those efforts. And so, where do you think tissue testing fits into a foliar nutritional program?
That's a topic I discuss quite a bit. So I think the grower really needs to consider how they're going to use the material before they ever get started. And if they have the ability to adjust on the fly, they should take a tissue sample just before they're planning to make any sort of pesticide application to the field. Then they can go be specific and intentional and try to address the specific needs of the plant. In most instances, I like to use it as a report card, where let's use it a little bit like a soil sample. Let's get a baseline, let's see how things are trending, and let's make sure that we consider that next year whenever we're going in and plan for our fertility needs for the plant. Because generally speaking, it takes unless you have a high production field that you're really pushing, a farmer's not going to be willing to put all the passes and inputs to capitalize on weekly or frequent tissue samples.
Yeah, so what you're saying is, number one, the tissue tests that we're doing this season can actually be used for the following season just as much potentially as they can for the current season. And so let's talk about that for just a minute. The current season then, if we say we run out here in 2 weeks and we do some tissue testing on a field of beans, can we use that data to make an application now? And if we do, will that application be effective, or are we just too late to the game?
Well, you can absolutely use it now. And you should use it now, because especially when you have a good crop and you're trying to push things or, ensure and protect yield, you should certainly do that. It'll let you know where the bullseye is, so to speak. So you certainly can use it now. By no means did I mean that and there are variations between years and between crops. So tissue samples can vary on the nutrient depending on the environment at the time, like the weather changes, the field conditions are changed because of moisture or what have you. So, but they're useful tools, and we need to start knowing how our fields and how our crops are reacting to the soil fertility program that we have. And so tissue analysis is great for that, and it's also useful to adjust on the fly. So
okay.
Use it both ways.
Well, and I think most of the tissue sampling that we've done in this area has always been related to the current season. And I'm not sure how many folks are going back and actually looking at last year's tissue samples to make decisions about the fertility in their fall programs or whatever. But from your perspective, that's something that we should be doing.
It is, and how I use them, which is very funny, is we've kind of hung up on boron and potassium, but it's very rare that I see tissue samples that are adequate in boron or potassium.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of soil samples that are adequate in at least potassium, maybe not boron, but it's not getting into the plant. So a tissue sample verifies that your soil sample tells you what you think it's telling. Because just because there's nutrients on your soil sample, it does not mean that they're necessarily making it into the plant. And we have to figure out what the issue is.
That's a really good point. So I think I agree with you. The combination of the soil sample and the tissue sample together can help you build a strong fertility program for the fall.
The one other fear, I mean, we definitely can adjust on the fly. We're short on phosphorus. Let's try to add some phosphorus in this next pass that we're going, especially if we're short on a micronutrient, manganese, boron, what have you. We can try to adjust. The fear I have with it, if we're always reactive and, let's say the tissue sample comes back and we're good on everything, we don't need to add a foliar application, then we've forgotten the other half of what a good foliar application does. It stimulates the plant, it makes the roots work better, it may increase the microbial load in the soil because we might have created more plant root exudates. So we can just because we're sufficient doesn't mean that it's not worth doing a nutrient application as well.
So a lot of benefits all the way around.
Correct.
Really. Let's talk now on something. I want to go back to something you said a few minutes ago, and you were talking about tank mixing. And so there were some thoughts that came to my mind as we were sitting here regarding tank mixing. And this is something that I think every grower is concerned about when we start adding products. You talked about tying up herbicide and whatnot, but let's talk about that fungicide pass. You're getting into the reproductive stage there, and the one thing that you really don't want to do is burn the beans. You don't want to see a negative crop response. And so are there some nutrients that a grower should avoid when you're making those types of applications?
There's certainly quantities of nutrients you need to be wary of. I mean, there's certain ones that have much more potential to burn the plant, and there's types of nutrients that you certainly need to avoid. Anything with nitrate of any sort has a very high burn potential. Sulfur I wouldn't avoid, but it certainly has some burn potential, and boron even has some burn potential. So we need to watch, but they're very necessary during that pod filling time. So we want to just make sure that we have quantities that the plant can handle. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to clarify for all the folks listening, there's so many products out there, okay? We could come up with 100 different nutritional products if we sat here for an hour. And they've all got different nutrients, there's different packages, et cetera, et cetera. So we could talk about that all day. But are there some things, that's really what I was asking, and you just said it, anything with nitrate in it, but are there some things that we should avoid during that reproductive stage, other than nitrate?
Well, extremely high levels of sulfur, extremely high, and it's hard for me to even quantify what extremely high is. We're playing with that all the time, seeing how much sulfur we can foliar feed and not burn the plant. So as far as me being able to just lay out, avoid these other than nitrate, chloride, of course, you don't want any chloride because it's very salty or has high burn potential as well. I can't come up with anything and say avoid this entirely. Be cautious with the quantities of sulfur and boron as well.
Okay. Well, let's move on, and I just want to ask you this real quick. And this is something that I'm going to do an entire podcast on, but since you're here today and with all of your experiences, I just want to ask your opinion. I think that biologicals are something that is really, at least in this territory, are really starting to take hold, gain a lot of interest. There is still a lot of skepticism, though, about them. And so just for a couple of minutes, talk to us about your thoughts about where biologicals fit in a soybean management program.
There's absolutely a place for biologicals. The problem, just like you said, there's lots of skepticism, and that's because, in my opinion, from what I've seen, biologicals are more of a niche. They really fit in this instance, but they didn't work in this instance. So as our soils vary, the biologic that you want to use really is may vary quite a bit. I'm always in favor of putting an inoculant. That's not a biologic. That's easy. But as far as guessing which bacteria, which mycorrhiza fungi are going to most benefit the soybean in your field, I'd say find someone that can explain why this should work in your field and your situation, and then try it. I'm very familiar with a couple of bacillus varieties. We have it in a Rhizolink product. It's excellent in low pH and high pH soils, for sure. And it's also very excellent whenever you have just recently manured or have some high salt. Those are the areas. So whoever's selling you the biologic, it'd be great if they knew exactly where they fit the best. And then if that fits your situation, then look at trying them there, because they certainly can work.
Yeah, and I think that's the right way to approach it. That's the way we're approaching it here at Cam Seeds, is we're just trialing. We've got a lot of trials out there, going to have a lot more in the coming months with different biologicals for different crops. And so we're just testing to see what works and what doesn't. You know, most of these companies that are developing these biologicals are not testing them here in Southeast Kansas. And so we're trying to do that and trying to see what works and what doesn't, because as you know, you kind of alluded to it, just because it works in Iowa doesn't mean that it's going to work here in Southeast Kansas. And so
I do believe they hold some real potential.
I do too. I agree with you, and I think there's a lot more to come there in that arena, and a lot more things that we're going to talk about here on the podcast in the future regarding those. So I want to put you on the spot now for just a minute, Wayne, and maybe I should have gotten you a pen and paper or something, but I want to talk for just a minute. I always like to have a section in the podcast about return on investment. And so I want to throw some soybean management practices out to you. And if you can, I would like for you to rank those in terms of what your opinion is for return on investment, okay? And so I'm going to throw 6 things out to you, and I can repeat those 6 things, but tell me what you think would be number 1, 2, and 3 on the list. And again, they don't all have to do with foliar nutrition. So number 1 is variety selection. Number 2, weed control. Number 3, fungicides. Number 4, foliar nutrition. Number 5, biologicals. And number 6, insect management.
Well, a couple of those things, if they're bad enough, they're going to completely wipe you out, such as the weeds and the insect management. So weeds has to be first. I mean, if we don't have the weeds controlled,
It's a disaster.
There's no way to make money.
No.
And then insects is going to be second, because if you don't have the insects controlled, so those are number 1 and number 2. We have to take care of those. Probably variety is you need a variety that's going to fit your growing conditions. So then now I have left foliar nutrition, biologics, and what else? What's the other one?
Fungicides and foliar. So fungicides, foliar nutrition, and biologicals. Those are the 3 that are left.
Foliar nutrition and fungicide are going to fit in there hand in hand. I don't know that in Southeast Kansas we always have to have a fungicide, but certain years are going to dictate that you need a fungicide, and I'm afraid that all those pests are the first things you have to take care of: weeds, insects, fungicide. But the foliar nutrition would be next, certainly before biologics, because foliar nutrition, we know that we're addressing this year's needs. We're addressing what we can do to promote and push yield and help that crop with its crop health, maybe even soil health, and promote greater production. So that's for this year. So it's really hard for me to say that that's all the way down there, 5th out of 6. But, I want the farmer to succeed, because I want him to come back next year with foliar. So foliar nutrition would be probably 5th in what you're saying there. And biologics, I'm not even 100% sure that that's something we need to worry about every year until we get it figured out.
Until we get more data. We do need more data there, and again, as I said a minute ago, that's something that we're working towards. So we'll see what happens in the coming years with that. I want to move now, Wayne, into what I call the rapid fire section. I do this in every podcast, and that's where I just ask you a series of questions. You can answer them with a short yes or no, or go into as much detail as you like. So, you ready?
Fire away.
All right. Boron on every acre, yes or no?
Yes.
Tissue testing, underutilized or overrated?
You make me get on that. I want to straddle the fence on that one. It's a little underutilized.
Okay. Foliar nutritionals, R1 or R3? What's best?
I'm going to say R1.
Okay. How about sulfur? Bigger deal or not at all?
I have seen some places where sulfur can be a huge deal, especially on soybeans. So I think it complements their nitrogen production quite a bit, and sulfur is a big deal on soybeans, I think.
Okay. Biologicals in 5 years, bigger market or smaller market?
I think it may take longer than 5 years to get it much larger, but I think it'll continue to grow, so I think it'll be larger in 5 years.
Okay. And last question, what do you think is the most overlooked soybean management practice?
I think that most people, it's changing. That's why we're having this discussion. But foliar feeding in general has been overlooked. And it's hard to know everything about everything that you're doing as a farmer. I'm no good as a mechanic, and if a farmer's not interested in digging into the nutritionals, looking at how this potassium source is different than this potassium source, it's got to be really frustrating. But we're overlooking getting a nutritional product out there that stimulates the biology and stimulates the plant health and gets them some nutrients all at the same time. In general, what I'm saying is we're overlooking all the good that the right source of nutrition can do for a plant. And we can do that with a foliar. It's a great place to start as we learn to push the biology and the nutrition all at the same time.
All right. Well, Wayne, I really appreciate you joining us today. Appreciate all of your comments and your extensive background and sharing with us today on these topics. And perhaps we can do this again in the future.
I'd love to. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, today's conversation about foliars really, I think, highlights something that we believe strongly in here at CAM Seeds, and that's that not every input creates value. Our goal here isn't just to sell products, it's to help farmers make more profitable decisions based on real data and real world agronomy. Because at the end of the day, the goal isn't to spend more money, it's to make more money. Isn't that why we're doing this?
Absolutely.
And so, again, appreciate you guys joining us today and listening to another episode of Dirt, Dollars, and Data. And remember, every decision we make in the field affects the dirt, it impacts your dollars, and should be backed by the data. I'm Chad Mustain. See you next time.
Dirt, dollars, and data.